When people talk about betrayal, they usually imagine something dramatic. Yelling, accusations, maybe even broken furniture. But for me, betrayal came quietly, wrapped in the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. It wasn't the kind of scene you'd expect, but it cut deeper than I thought anything could. It started like any other party. Carla, one of our closest friends, had just finished renovating her house, and she decided to throw a housewarming party. Elena, my wife, was excited. She spent the entire afternoon getting ready, doing her hair, picking out the perfect dress, and reapplying her makeup 3 times. I didn't think much of it. Elena has always liked to make an impression, and I've always been okay with it. But looking back, there was something different about her energy that night, something I missed. When we arrived, the house was already buzzing. Carla had gone all out, catered food, a makeshift dance floor, even a DJ in the corner. Elena dove into the crowd immediately, greeting everyone like she was the star of the night. I stayed back, nursing a beer and chatting with David, a friend of ours who works in finance. That's when I saw him. Jason, the guy I hadn't thought about in years, but immediately remembered as soon as I saw his smirking face. Jason had been my college roommate for 1 semester before I requested a transfer. He was arrogant, always trying to one-up me, and back then, I didn't have the patience to deal with it. I hadn't seen him in over a decade, but here he was, shaking hands, laughing loudly, and somehow managing to command the room like he always did. I didn't think much of it at first, until I noticed him talking to Elena. She was laughing, that loud, carefree laugh she used to save for me. She leaned in close as he talked, her hand lightly brushing his arm. I told myself it was nothing. Elena was a social butterfly. She liked people. But as the night went on, I realized she wasn't just talking to Jason. She was staying near him, orbiting him like he was the sun, and she couldn't pull away. I kept my distance. I didn't want to be that guy, the husband who hovers, who gets territorial at a party. So I let it go, even as my beer grew warm in my hand and the knot in my stomach tightened. Then it happened. Carla called everyone into the living room for a toast. We all gathered around, glasses raised as Carla thanked us for coming and made some jokes about the renovation process. Jason, ever the showman, couldn't resist chiming in, cracking a joke that made the whole room laugh. Elena laughed the loudest, her eyes sparkling as she glanced at him. And then, right there, in front of everyone, she leaned over and kissed him. It wasn't a quick peck. It was deliberate, slow enough for everyone to see. The room went silent for a split second, and then the laughter picked up again, awkward and scattered, as if no one knew how to react. But the worst part wasn't the kiss. It was what she said after. "He's a real man," she announced, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. I felt the words hit me like a punch to the gut. The room spun, but I didn't move. I couldn't. I stood there, frozen, as everyone pretended not to notice the humiliation painted across my face. I don't know how long I stayed like that, rooted to the spot. A few seconds? A few minutes? It felt like forever. But eventually, the chatter resumed, and people went back to their drinks and conversations, as if nothing had happened. Elena didn't even glance my way. She turned back to Jason, laughing at something he said, her hand resting lightly on his arm. I wanted to leave, to grab my coat, walk out the door, and never look back. But I didn't. I stayed, my fists clenched, my jaw tight, waiting for the moment I could get her alone. I wasn't going to cause a scene. Not here, not in front of our friends. But I wasn't going to let this slide either. When the room started to clear out, I finally made my move. I walked over to Elena, my voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." She looked at me, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, I thought she might actually feel guilty. But then she smirked, a small, infuriating smirk that sent a wave of anger through me. "Sure," she said, as if we were just discussing what to have for dinner. I waited until we were alone, the laughter of our friends fading as the last of them trickled out the door. Then, and only then, did I let her see the storm brewing inside me. Because if she wanted to see what a real man looked like, I was about to show her. The drive home after the party was suffocatingly silent. Elena sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened, while I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I couldn't speak, not yet. The words were there, bubbling under the surface, but I wasn't ready to let them out. Not until I could figure out how to say what I needed to say without exploding. When we pulled into the driveway, she didn't wait for me to say anything. She just grabbed her purse and headed inside, leaving me alone in the car, staring at the darkened windows of our house. I sat there for a while, the engine still running, trying to calm the storm inside me. My thoughts were a chaotic mess, tangled with anger, humiliation, and something else I didn't want to name, hurt. Eventually, I turned off the car and went inside. Elena was already in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine. Her heels kicked off by the door as if she hadn't just humiliated me in front of all our friends. I stood there for a moment, watching her, waiting for her to say something, anything, that would acknowledge what she'd done. But she didn't. Instead, she glanced up at me, her expression bored. Are you going to keep sulking, or are we going to talk about it? I felt my jaw tighten. Sulking. That's what she thought this was? You kissed him, I said, my voice low, careful, like I was holding back a dam ready to burst. In front of everyone. She shrugged, taking a sip of her wine. It was a joke, Mark. Don't be so dramatic. A joke? I repeated, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. You called him a real man. In front of all our friends. Do you think that's funny? She rolled her eyes, setting the glass down on the counter. You're overreacting. Jason's just a friend. It didn't mean anything. I stared at her, searching her face for any sign of remorse, but there was none. Just that infuriating indifference. You humiliated me, I said quietly, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. Do you have any idea how that felt? She sighed, leaning back against the counter like I was wasting her time. Mark, you're being ridiculous. No one cares about that stuff except you. Everyone else probably forgot about it 5 minutes later. That doesn't make it okay. I snapped, my voice finally breaking. You didn't just disrespect me. You disrespected our marriage. Do you even care about that anymore? She flinched at that, but only for a second. Then her expression hardened, and she crossed her arms over her chest. Maybe if you acted like more of a husband and less of a roommate, I wouldn't have to joke around like that. Her words hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I'd always known there were issues between us, unspoken tensions that had been simmering for years, but hearing her say it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. What's that supposed to mean? I asked, my voice quieter now, almost afraid of the answer. It means I'm tired, Mark, she said, her voice rising now, her frustration bubbling to the surface. I'm tired of the silence. I'm tired of feeling like I'm the only one trying in this marriage. You go to work, you come home, you sit on the couch. Where's the passion? The ambition? The man I married? I stared at her, stunned. So kissing Jason was your way of fixing that? I shot back, my anger flaring again. Of reigniting the spark? It was a mistake, okay? She snapped, throwing her hands up in frustration. I was trying to get your attention, and clearly, it worked. I opened my mouth to argue, to tell her how wrong she was, but I stopped myself. What was the point? She wasn't listening. She didn't care. Not really. I could feel it in the way she looked at me, like I was already losing whatever battle we were fighting. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there. I went to the bedroom, shutting the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. The silence in the house felt heavier now, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I thought about everything she'd said, about the lack of passion, the lack of ambition. Was she right? Had I really become the kind of man who just went through the motions? Or was this just her way of justifying what she'd done? I didn't know anymore. All I knew was that something had shifted between us, and I wasn't sure it could be fixed. I'd spent years trying to be the steady one, the reliable one, the husband who provided, who supported, who stayed. But now, it seemed like none of that mattered. Not to her. Not anymore. As I sat there in the dark, I made a decision. I wasn't going to yell, I wasn't going to beg, and I wasn't going to let her break me. If Elena wanted to see what a real man looked like, I'd show her. but not the way she expected. Because power isn't about making noise. It's about knowing when to stay silent. And in that silence, I started to form a plan. A way to take back control. A way to remind her, and myself, who I really was. The days after the party were almost worse than the night itself. If the humiliation in the moment felt like a punch, the aftermath felt like a slow, twisting knife. Elena might have shrugged the whole thing off, but I knew our friends weren't going to let it go so easily. People love a scandal, and my marriage had just turned into one. I first noticed it on Monday morning, when I got a text from David, my closest friend in the group. "Hey man, how are you holding up?" No context, no lead-in, just straight to the point. I stared at the message for a long time before typing out a reply. "I'm fine." "Why?" David's response came immediately. "You know why. Carla told me everything. Call me if you need to talk." Carla. Of course. She couldn't keep her mouth shut for 10 minutes, let alone an entire weekend. If she told David, chances were the whole group knew by now. And sure enough, the group chat lit up that afternoon with vague, awkward messages that were clearly fishing for a reaction from me. "Hey Mark, great seeing you at the party. That housewarming was eventful, huh? Hope you and Elena are doing okay." I didn't reply to any of them. What could I say? That my wife had kissed another man in front of all of them and called him a real man? That I was still trying to figure out what the hell to do about it? No, silence felt safer. But the silence didn't last long. On Tuesday, I ran into Carla at the grocery store. She was her usual bubbly self, tossing organic produce into her cart and chatting with the cashier like she didn't have a care in the world. When she spotted me, her face lit up and she practically skipped over to me. "Mark. Oh my gosh, I've been meaning to call you," she said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "How are you doing? After, the party?" I wanted to tell her to mind her own business, but instead, I forced a smile. "I'm fine, Carla. Thanks for asking." She tilted her head, studying me like I was some kind of science experiment. "You don't look fine. I mean, I can't even imagine how I'd feel if..." She stopped herself, probably realizing she was about to say too much. "I just mean, if you ever need to talk, I'm here for you." "Thanks, Carla," I said tightly, grabbing a loaf of bread off the shelf and moving toward the next aisle. But she followed me, undeterred. "Honestly, though, Elena must have had too much to drink," she said, lowering her voice as if the whole store was eavesdropping. "She probably didn't even realize what she was doing. You know how she gets at parties." I stopped walking and turned to face her. "Carla," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "I appreciate your concern, but this is between Elena and me. Let's leave it at that." She blinked, clearly caught off guard by my tone. "Of course, Mark. I didn't mean to overstep." But she had, and we both knew it. That encounter was just the beginning. Over the next few days, I started noticing the subtle shifts in how people acted around me. David, who had always been direct and no-nonsense, suddenly seemed hesitant, like he didn't know what to say. Sophia, one of Elena's closest friends, went out of her way to defend her every chance she got. "She didn't mean anything by it, Mark," Sophia said when she cornered me at the coffee shop one morning. "You know how Jason is. He's charming, but it's harmless." Elena was probably just caught up in the moment. Caught up in the moment? I repeated, my voice colder than I intended. "She kissed him, Sophia, in front of everyone. That's not harmless." Sophia sighed, shaking her head. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "Am I?" I asked, staring her down. "Would you feel the same way if your husband kissed someone else in front of you?" She didn't answer, and I walked away before she could come up with an excuse. Then there was Jason. I ran into him at a cafe downtown a few days later. He was sitting at a corner table, sipping an espresso and looking as smug as ever. When he spotted me, he waved me over, like we were old friends. "Mark, what a surprise," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I was just thinking about you." I didn't sit down. "Were you?" I said, my voice flat. "Of course," he said, flashing that infuriating grin. "I hope there are no hard feelings about the other night. You know how Elena is, always the life of the party." "She's my wife," I said evenly, staring him down. "Not your entertainment." His grin faltered for a split second before he recovered. Hey, no disrespect, man. I didn't mean anything by it. Just having a little fun. Good, I said, my voice low. Because if it happens again, you'll regret it. Jason's smile disappeared completely, and I turned and walked out of the cafe, my heart pounding. I hadn't planned to say that, but it felt good, necessary, even. For the first time since the party, I felt like I had some control over the situation. But the truth was, the damage was already done. My friends had seen the cracks in my marriage, and Jason had seen an opportunity to exploit them. And Elena? She seemed oblivious to the storm she'd created, going about her days like nothing had happened. But something had happened, and I wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. By the time the dust settled from the party and its aftermath, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living like this, sitting around feeling humiliated, stewing in anger and hurt, waiting for Elena to throw me another curveball. It wasn't going to work. If I wanted to take control of my life, I had to start doing something about it. The first step was simple, even if it felt like a slap to my pride. I needed help. Not from our nosy friends or anyone in our circle, but from someone who could help me think clearly. That's when I reached out to Rachel. Rachel and I had been friends years ago, back before I met Elena. She was smart, empathetic, and, most importantly, a therapist. We hadn't spoken much over the years, but when I called her and explained my situation, she didn't hesitate. She agreed to meet me for coffee the following week. Sitting across from her at the little cafe downtown felt strange at first. I wasn't used to opening up, and definitely not about my marriage. But Rachel made it easy. She didn't judge, didn't interrupt, just listened as I spilled everything. The party, the kiss, the fallout, my doubts about myself, and the simmering anger I couldn't seem to shake. When I finally finished, she leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. Mark, it sounds like you've spent so much time trying to hold everything together that you've forgotten to take care of yourself. The words hit harder than I expected. She was right. For years, I'd been so focused on being the steady, dependable one, providing for the family, keeping the peace, trying to make Elena happy, that I'd lost sight of who I was outside of all that. What do? I asked, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. Rachel smiled gently. You start by finding yourself again. What makes you happy, Mark? What gives you a sense of purpose? You need to reconnect with that before you can decide what to do about Elena. Her advice stayed with me long after that conversation. And for the first time in a long time, I started to think about what I wanted. Not what Elena wanted, or what our friends thought, but what I needed to feel like myself again. I began making small changes. I started going to the gym after work, something I hadn't done in years. At first, it was awkward. I felt out of place among the younger, more fit crowd. But after a few weeks, I started to feel stronger, both physically and mentally. There was something satisfying about pushing myself, setting goals, and seeing progress. It reminded me that I was capable of more than I'd given myself credit for. I also started focusing more on my career. For years, I'd been content to stay in the same position, earning a steady paycheck but never really pushing myself. Now, I began looking for opportunities to grow. I signed up for leadership workshops, volunteered for challenging projects, and even started networking with colleagues I'd barely spoken to before. It felt good to be ambitious again, to remind myself that I had something to offer. But the most surprising change came at home. As I focused on myself, I stopped engaging in the endless arguments with Elena. When she made snide comments, I didn't bite. When she tried to start a fight, I walked away. It wasn't about ignoring her. It was about refusing to let her control my emotions. And slowly, I noticed a shift in her too. She seemed unsettled, confused, even. She wasn't used to me being so calm, so in control. One evening, after weeks of this new dynamic, she finally said something. You've been different lately, she said, her voice cautious. I looked up from the book I was reading, keeping my tone casual. Yeah, I guess I have. She frowned, clearly expecting more of a reaction. Is it because of the party? Are you still mad? I closed the book and set it aside, meeting her gaze. I'm not mad, Elena. I'm just done letting other people define who I am, including you. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't say anything. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in her expression, a crack in the armor she'd worn so confidently since the party. But I wasn't done yet. I had one more step in my plan, and it involved Jason. The smug satisfaction he'd worn that night had been eating at me ever since, and I knew I couldn't move forward until I dealt with him. It started small. I did some digging, nothing too invasive, just enough to learn a few things about him. His business, his reputation, his weaknesses. And what I found was illuminating. Jason wasn't as untouchable as he liked to pretend. In fact, he had more skeletons in his closet than I expected. Financial troubles, burned bridges, and a reputation for being manipulative. I didn't confront him, not yet. That would come later, when the timing was right. For now, I kept the information to myself, knowing it was a card I could play when the moment called for it. As the weeks went on, I started to feel like myself again. Stronger, more confident, and more in control. Elena might not have realized it yet, but the balance of power in our relationship was shifting. I wasn't the same man who stood silently at that party, humiliated and unsure of what to do. I was becoming someone new, someone who knew his worth and wasn't afraid to demand respect. And when the time came to show Elena and Jason what that looked like, I'd be ready. Elena thought she was untouchable, gliding through life with an air of confidence that made her seem invincible. But no one's perfect. No one's life is as flawless as they like to pretend. And as I began to rebuild myself, to find strength in my own silence and determination, I started to notice things, small cracks in her carefully curated image. It started with little clues. A text she received late at night, her phone lighting up on the counter as she brushed past without answering my glance. The way she'd suddenly pull back from conversations when I walked into her room, her voice lowering as if she were guarding a secret. It wasn't enough to accuse her of anything outright, but it was enough to make me curious. Curiosity is a funny thing. It's not something I used to indulge in, but after what happened at the party, I felt justified in seeking answers. And if Elena wasn't going to be honest with me, I'd find out the truth myself. I started paying attention. Not obsessively. I didn't want to be that guy. But enough to notice patterns. For one, she was spending more time out of the house. "I have to meet Sophia," she'd say casually, grabbing her purse on the way out. Or, "Carla wants to go over ideas for the charity event." Always vague, always nonchalant. But when I checked with Sophia and Carla during casual conversations, their stories didn't match Elena's. Sophia hadn't seen her in weeks. Carla barely spoke to her outside of group events. So where was she going? Then there was Jason. I hadn't seen him since our tense encounter at the cafe, but his name lingered in conversations Elena had with her friends. It was subtle, but there. Jason's opinions, Jason's jokes, Jason's plans. It was as though he was slipping into the cracks of our marriage, inserting himself into spaces where he didn't belong. And Elena wasn't stopping him. So I started digging, not out of paranoia, but out of a need to protect myself. If Elena had chosen to align herself with someone like Jason, I needed to know exactly what I was up against. And what I found was both illuminating and infuriating. Jason's perfect facade was just that, a facade. Behind the charm and the smiles, he was drowning in financial trouble. He'd been quietly ousted from 2 business partnerships due to irreconcilable differences, which was corporate speak for Jason can't be trusted. He was living off borrowed time, relying on his reputation to keep him afloat while his debts piled up. But that wasn't all. Jason had a history of meddling in relationships. An old friend of his reached out to me, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, but who heard about the party through mutual acquaintances. "Watch your back with Jason," he said bluntly. "He has a thing for married women, likes to stir the pot, see how far he can push things." I wasn't surprised, but it confirmed what I already suspected. Jason wasn't just a smug opportunist. He was a predator, feeding off the chaos he created. And Elena? Whether she realized it or not, she was playing right into his hands. I kept the information to myself for a while, letting it simmer as I continued to observe. Meanwhile, Elena began to notice the changes in me. I wasn't reacting the way I used to. Not to her snide remarks, not to her cold shoulders, not even to her vague excuses. Instead, I focused on myself, on my career, on building a version of me that didn't rely on her validation. And it drove her crazy. "You've been so distant lately," she said one night, her voice laced with irritation as we sat across the dinner table. "You barely talk to me anymore." I raised an eyebrow, setting down my fork. "Funny, I could say the same about you." Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she crossed her arms, leaning back in her chair. "Are you still mad about the party? Because I told you, it didn't mean anything." "That's not what this is about," I said evenly, keeping my tone calm. "This is about respect, Elena. And right now, I'm not feeling a lot of it." She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. "And don't tell me it's just me being sensitive. You know as well as I do that things haven't been right for a long time. I'm just the first one to admit it." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for once, she didn't have a quick comeback. Good. Let her sit with it. But I wasn't done. Over the next few weeks, I began dropping subtle hints that I knew more than I was letting on. I'd mentioned Jason's business troubles in passing, watching her face carefully for a reaction. I'd bring up our friend circle's chatter, framing it as casual gossip, but always steering the conversation back to the party. And slowly, cracks began to appear in her armor. It wasn't just guilt. I could see it in her eyes. It was fear. Fear that I knew too much, that her carefully controlled narrative was slipping out of her hands. And she was right. It was only a matter of time before I confronted her fully, laying everything bare. But I wasn't rushing. No, this wasn't something to be handled impulsively. If Jason and Elena thought they had the upper hand, they were sorely mistaken. Because while they were busy playing games, I was quietly building my case, piece by piece. And when the time came, I'd make sure there was nowhere left for them to hide. By the time I hosted the gathering at our home, I knew exactly what I was doing. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my voice, and, most importantly, my power. For weeks, I had been patient, watching, listening, and preparing. Elena and Jason thought they held the upper hand, but they didn't realize I'd been quietly turning the tide. The idea for the gathering wasn't mine initially. It was Carla's. "You guys should host something," she suggested during a phone call. "You know, get everyone together again after the party. Clear the air." She didn't say it outright, but I knew what she meant. To let everyone see whether Elena and I were okay. To let them judge if our marriage had survived. At first, I wasn't sure if I wanted to do it. Hosting a party after what had happened felt like inviting scrutiny into my home, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was the perfect opportunity. If Elena and Jason wanted to play their games, I would set the board. And this time, I would be in control. Elena was surprisingly enthusiastic about the idea. She dove into planning with a level of energy I hadn't seen in months, as if she believed this was her chance to rewrite the narrative. "We'll make it classy," she said, jotting down a list of appetizers and drinks. "Something low-key but elegant." I let her take the lead. It was easier that way, and besides, her distraction gave me the space I needed to finalize my plans. I reached out to a few people quietly, David, Carla, and a few others I trusted, and planted subtle seeds in their minds about Jason. "Have you heard about his business troubles?" I'd say, as if it were casual gossip. "Crazy, right? You'd never guess with how confident he acts." By the time the night of the gathering arrived, I was ready. The house was immaculate, the food and drinks perfectly arranged, and Elena had dressed to impress, wearing a sleek black dress that made her look every bit the charming hostess. She flitted around the room, greeting guests and laughing at their jokes, while I stood back, observing. And then, of course, Jason arrived. He walked in like he owned the place, flashing that same smug smile that had been haunting me since the party. "Mark," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Good to see you again. Thanks for the invite." I smiled back, calm and composed. "Of course, Jason. Wouldn't want you to miss out." The evening unfolded smoothly at first. Guests mingled, glasses clinked, and the air buzzed with light-hearted conversation. But underneath the surface, tension simmered. I could see it in the way Elena avoided my gaze whenever Jason was nearby, in the way Jason's eyes flicked toward me, gauging my reactions. They thought I was oblivious. They thought I was the same man they'd humiliated weeks ago. They were wrong. As the night progressed, I waited for my moment. It came when the group naturally gathered in the living room, chatting about relationships, careers, and life in general. Jason, predictably, took the spotlight, launching into a story about one of his so-called business triumphs. The way he spoke, you'd think he was running a Fortune 500 company instead of drowning in debt. When he finished, the room chuckled politely, and I saw my opening. "That's interesting, Jason," I said, my tone casual. "I heard your company's been going through some tough times lately. Something about a bad investment?" The room went silent. Jason's smile faltered for a split second before he recovered. "Oh, you know how it is," he said, brushing it off. "Ups and downs. Part of the game." "True," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "But it must be stressful, especially with those lawsuits piling up. I imagine it's hard to focus on growth when you're busy putting out fires." Jason's face hardened, and I caught the flicker of unease in Elena's eyes. She shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing where this was going. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, Mark," Jason said, his tone tight. "Oh, I'm sure you don't," I said, letting a faint smile creep onto my face. "But I'd be happy to fill you in later. Over drinks, maybe?" The room was dead quiet now, all eyes darting between Jason and me. He tried to laugh it off, but the damage was done. His carefully constructed image had taken a hit, and everyone in the room knew it. Elena pulled me aside later, her voice low and urgent. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "Why are you trying to embarrass him?" "I'm not trying," I said calmly. "I'm succeeding." Her eyes flashed with anger, but there was something else there too, fear. For the first time in a long time, I saw her uncertainty, her doubt. She wasn't in control anymore, and she knew it. As the night wound down and guests began to leave, I stood by the door, thanking them for coming. Jason avoided me on his way out, mumbling something about an early meeting. Elena lingered near the kitchen, avoiding my gaze. When the last guest was gone, I turned to her, my voice steady. "Now we talk." She didn't argue. She knew this conversation had been coming, and as we sat down in the now empty living room, I could feel the shift in the air. I wasn't the same man who stood silently at that first party, humiliated and unsure of what to do. I had taken back my power, and it was time for Elena to see what that really meant. The living room felt heavy, almost suffocating, as Elena and I sat across from each other. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of a car passing outside were the only noises breaking the silence. She sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes flickering everywhere except to me. I leaned back in my chair, calm on the outside, but inside, I was bracing for the storm. This wasn't just a conversation. It was a reckoning. "You've been quiet all night," I said finally, breaking the tension. "I'm surprised. Usually, you're the life of the party." She flinched at the edge in my voice, but quickly masked it with indignation. "What do you want me to say, Mark? You've been acting like a completely different person lately. I don't even recognize you." I let out a short laugh, low and bitter. "That's funny, coming from you. Do you even recognize yourself, Elena? Or has Jason's flattery blurred the lines too much?" Her face reddened, and her mouth opened as if to fire back, but then she stopped. For a brief moment, I saw something crack in her. Guilt, maybe, regret, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She crossed her arms and leaned back, her eyes narrowing. "This isn't about Jason," she said sharply. "This is about you. About us. About how we've been drifting apart for years, Mark. You can't seriously think everything that's happened is all my fault." I nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. "You're right," I said evenly. "It's not all your fault. But let's not pretend like you kissing another man in front of our friends was some cry for help. That wasn't about us, Elena. That was about you." Her eyes widened, and I could see the anger boiling just beneath the surface. "I kissed him because I was angry," she snapped. "Because you make me feel invisible, Mark. You bury yourself in work, you go through the motions at home, and I'm just here, like a piece of furniture. Do you know how exhausting it is to feel like you're screaming into a void every single day?" Her voice cracked at the end, and for the first time, I saw real emotion there, real pain, but it didn't absolve her actions. It didn't erase the hurt she'd caused. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and locked eyes with her. I get it, I said quietly. You're angry. You feel ignored. And maybe I failed you in some ways. But none of that justifies what you did. You humiliated me, Elena. You disrespected me, not just as your husband, but as a person. And what's worse, you didn't even care. Her face softened, her defiance faltering. That's not true, she whispered. I didn't mean to hurt you. Didn't you? I countered, my voice steady but firm. You kissed Jason, knowing exactly how it would look. You called him a real man, knowing exactly how it would feel. And even after all of that, you haven't once apologized. Not once. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Then let me make it simple, I said, leaning back again. Do you want this marriage to work? Do you still want to be my wife? Because if you do, it's going to take a hell of a lot more than excuses and avoidance to fix this. The question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. For the first time, Elena looked truly vulnerable. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and she took a shaky breath before meeting my gaze. I do, she said softly. I want us to work, Mark. I do. But I don't know how to fix this. Her admission surprised me, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. It starts with honesty, I said. No more lies, no more games. I need to know the truth, Elena, about everything. About Jason, about us, about what you really want. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. For a moment, I thought she might retreat, that her pride would win out over her sincerity. But then she looked up at me, and I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Vulnerability. Jason was a distraction, she admitted, her voice trembling. He made me feel wanted, and I let it go too far. But it wasn't real, Mark. It was never real. I know that now. I nodded, my expression unreadable. And what about us? I asked. Do you feel anything for me? Or have we been running on fumes? Her tears spilled over then, and she shook her head. I feel everything for you, she said, her voice breaking. That's the problem. I've been so afraid of losing you that I pushed you away instead. And now I don't even know if I deserve another chance. Her words hung in the air, raw and honest, and for the first time, I felt the anger in my chest begin to ease. It wasn't gone, not by a long shot, but it was muted now, tempered by the realization that she wasn't as invincible as she pretended to be. I can't promise this will be easy, I said finally, and I can't promise that I'll forget what you did. But if you're willing to put in the work, so am I. That's the only way we move forward. She nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. I'll do whatever it takes, she said quietly. I just want us back. The conversation ended with no clear resolution, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like we were standing on the same side of the battlefield. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The conversation with Elena had been a turning point, but it didn't mean I was ready to let go of everything. Forgiveness doesn't come easily when the wounds are still fresh, and Jason wasn't someone I was going to let walk away unscathed. If Elena wanted to rebuild our marriage, she'd have to accept that I wasn't the same man who stood silently humiliated in that living room weeks ago. Jason needed to learn what happens when you cross boundaries, and I wasn't going to let him slink off into the shadows like nothing happened. The pieces of his downfall were already in place. I'd spent weeks gathering information, quietly listening, and connecting the dots. Jason's charm was a mask, hiding a web of debt, manipulation, and burned bridges. His smug confidence wasn't built on solid ground. It was built on sand, and all it would take was one good push to bring it crumbling down. I started small, planting seeds in the right places. David, one of our mutual friends, was well connected in Jason's professional circle. During a casual lunch, I mentioned Jason's questionable business practices, framing it as harmless gossip. Did you hear about the lawsuit he's dealing with? Something about unpaid debts. I don't know all the details, but it sounds messy. David raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. No, I hadn't heard that. Jason's always seemed like he had it all together. I shrugged, keeping my tone casual. Yeah, well, appearances can be deceiving. Just thought you'd want to know. Might be worth keeping an eye on. By the time our conversation ended, I knew the wheels were already in motion. David was the type to dig for information, and I had no doubt he'd spread the word to others in their circle. Jason's reputation wasn't just his armor, it was his lifeline. Without it, he had nothing. But that wasn't enough. I wanted Jason to feel the consequences of his arrogance in a way he wouldn't forget. The opportunity came at another gathering, this time a charity gala that Carla had invited us to. I knew Jason would be there, parading his charm and wealth like he always did. Elena, hesitant but determined to mend things between us, agreed to go with me. She had no idea what I had planned, and I didn't tell her. This wasn't about her. This was about me reclaiming my power. When we arrived, the room was buzzing with chatter, glasses clinking as well-dressed guests mingled. Jason was in his element, standing near the bar, laughing loudly and holding court like a king among his subjects. But this time, I wasn't going to let him command the room. I approached him calmly, a drink in hand, and gave him a polite nod. Jason. He turned, his smile faltering for a split second before he recovered. Mark, good to see you. Enjoying the evening? Absolutely, I replied smoothly, swirling the drink in my hand. It's a nice event. Carla always knows how to put something special together. I see you're working the room as usual. Jason chuckled, his confidence slipping back into place. What can I say? People gravitate toward me. They do, I agreed, my tone sharp enough to draw his attention. But then again, you've always been good at making people see what you want them to see, haven't you? Jason's grin froze, and I could see the faintest flicker of unease in his eyes. Not sure what you're getting at, Mark. Just an observation, I said, leaning in slightly. Like how you've built this whole image. Successful, charming, untouchable. It's impressive, really, considering the reality is a bit messy, eh? His jaw tightened, and I knew I'd struck a nerve. He tried to laugh it off, but it sounded forced. You've been hearing some gossip, I take it? Oh, not gossip, I said, letting a slow smile creep onto my face. Facts. Things about your lawsuits, your debts, the businesses you've run into the ground. It's all very illuminating. Jason's face darkened, his usual charm nowhere to be found. You're out of line. No, Jason, I said, my voice dropping just enough for only him to hear. You were out of line the moment you decided to humiliate me in my own home. Did you really think I'd let that slide? Before he could respond, I turned to the small group of people nearby, David among them, and raised my glass. Everyone, I was just telling Jason how impressive it is that he keeps things running despite, well, you know, all the challenges he's been facing lately. The murmurs started immediately, eyes darting between Jason and me. David, ever the opportunist, seized the moment. Challenges? Mark, what are you talking about? Jason opened his mouth, likely to deflect, but I cut him off. Oh, just some tough breaks in his businesses. You know how it goes. Lawsuits, unpaid debts, investors pulling out. It's a tough world out there. The color drained from Jason's face as the whispers spread like wildfire. He tried to regain control, stammering something about misunderstandings and exaggerations, but it was too late. The carefully constructed image he'd spent years building was cracking, and everyone in the room could see it. I didn't stick around to watch him squirm. I stepped away, leaving him to fend for himself as the sharks circled. Elena caught up with me near the edge of the room, her face pale. What did you do? She asked, her voice a mix of shock and disbelief. I looked at her, my expression calm but firm. I showed him what happens when you cross the line, Elena. He's not as untouchable as he thinks he is. She didn't respond right away, her eyes searching mine. This isn't you, Mark. No, I said quietly. It's the new me. The one who doesn't sit back and let people walk all over him. For the rest of the evening, Jason stayed in the background, his charm nowhere to be found. The whispers followed him wherever he went, and I knew it was only the beginning. His downfall wasn't complete, but the foundation had been shattered. As Elena and I drove home in silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: control. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my voice, my power, and my place in a world where I'd let people like Jason take advantage for far too long. Jason had finally seen the cracks in his own facade, and the game was over. The house was quiet when we got home from the gala. Elena and I hadn't spoken much on the drive back, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. She seemed unsettled, her usual sharp confidence dulled, and I wasn't sure if it was because of what I'd done to Jason or what it meant for us. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, my mind replaying the events of the night. It wasn't just about Jason anymore, what I'd done, the way I'd exposed him. It was as much for me as it was for anyone else. I'd taken back control, reclaimed my dignity, but now the real question loomed. What came next for Elena and me? She appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed and her face drawn. "Was that necessary?" she asked softly. I took a sip of water, setting the glass down on the counter before meeting her gaze. "What do you think?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. I don't know what to think. You were so calm, so calculated. That's not the Mark I know." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "Maybe the Mark you know isn't the one I need to be anymore." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, she looked as though she might argue. But then her shoulders sagged, and she let out a shaky breath. "I don't know how we got here," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't even recognize us anymore." "That makes two of us," I replied, my tone even but not unkind. "But you don't get to act like this is something that just happened, Elena. You made choices. We both did. And now we're here." She nodded slowly, her fingers twisting the hem of her dress. "You're right. I made choices, bad ones. But I need to know, do you still want this? Do you still want us?" The vulnerability in her voice caught me off guard. For all the anger and resentment I'd felt toward her, seeing her like this, uncertain, raw, stirred something in me I couldn't quite name. I ran a hand through my hair, letting the silence stretch between us before answering. "I don't know," I admitted. "I want to believe we can fix this, but I don't think I can do it alone. You've got to meet me halfway, Elena. No more games, no more avoiding the hard stuff. If we're going to make this work, it has to be real. Honest." She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can do that. I want to do that." I studied her face, searching for any trace of insincerity, but I didn't see any. For the first time in weeks, she looked like the woman I'd fallen in love with, the one who used to light up a room just by being in it, the one who, despite everything, still held a piece of my heart. "Then let's try," I said, my voice steady but cautious. "But I need to see it, Elena. Words won't fix this. Actions will." She nodded again, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'll prove it to you," she said, her voice cracking. "I swear I will." As we stood there, the silence between us shifted. It wasn't resolved, not yet, but it wasn't as heavy as before. There was something else now, hope, fragile but present. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step. And for now, that was enough. The days after our conversation felt like cautiously stepping onto thin ice. Each interaction with Elena was laced with unspoken questions. Could I trust her again? Was she truly committed to fixing this? And, most pressing of all, could we rediscover the love we'd lost beneath the layers of resentment, anger, and hurt? Elena seemed determined to prove herself. She started small, showing up in ways she hadn't in years. She asked about my work, genuinely listening to my answers instead of just nodding through them. She spent more time with the kids, laughing and playing with them in ways that reminded me of the woman she used to be, the one who lit up our home with her energy and warmth. It was a start, but I wasn't ready to let my guard down completely. I, too, had made changes, and I wasn't about to backslide into old habits. I continued to focus on myself, on the parts of me that had been overshadowed by the grind of daily life. My time at the gym became a ritual, a reminder of the strength I was reclaiming. I threw myself into my work, taking on projects that challenged me, rebuilding the confidence I hadn't even realized I'd lost. But more than that, I was learning to set boundaries. With Elena, with our friends, even with myself. I wasn't willing to go back to being the man who stayed silent, who let things slide for the sake of keeping the peace. If we were going to move forward, it would be on equal footing. The first real test came a few weeks later, when Carla invited us to another gathering. It was smaller than the gala, more intimate, and I could tell Elena was nervous about attending. "Do you think people will talk?" she asked as we got ready. "They'll always talk," I said, adjusting my tie in the mirror. "The question is, does it matter?" She paused, watching me, and then nodded. "No, it doesn't." At the party, we presented a united front. Elena stayed close to me, her interactions with others careful but genuine. Jason wasn't there. His absence spoke volumes, and I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction knowing his influence had waned. People noticed the difference in us, too. David pulled me aside at one point and said, "You two seem better, stronger, even." "Work in progress," I replied, and I meant it. As the weeks turned into months, Elena and I began to rebuild. Not just our marriage, but our understanding of each other. Therapy became a regular part of our lives, giving us a space to address the wounds we'd both been ignoring for far too long. It wasn't easy. There were moments when old habits threatened to resurface, when the weight of the past felt like too much to carry. But for the first time in years, we were fighting for each other instead of against each other. One night, as we sat on the porch after putting the kids to bed, Elena turned to me and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me, on us." I looked at her, the sincerity in her eyes catching me off guard. "Thank you for proving it was worth not giving up," I replied. It wasn't a perfect ending, because real life doesn't work that way. There were still challenges ahead, still moments of doubt and struggle. But what mattered was that we were trying, truly trying, for the first time in a long time. In the quiet of that night, as we sat side by side under the stars, I realized something important. Power isn't about control or dominance. It's about knowing your worth, setting your boundaries, and standing firm in who you are. And for the first time in years, I felt like we both understood that. This wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where respect, honesty, and growth would guide us forward. And for the first time, I felt hopeful about where we were headed.